friends. Operational situation at the front on the 15th of February. We will start with you in the Skopinski-Lemensky direction. We will talk in more detail about the Bakhmut and Yarsky sector of the front, about the Avdeevka direction, and, well, Kurakhovsky. Let's start with the Sinkovka. Added clarifications for us north of Sinkovka. The footage was published. The footage is not quite fresh, but it still shows the real situation where the enemy has been attacking lately. Attacks are not only familiar to us on one of the northern streets and west of Tinkovka, but there was also an attempt to bypass the Sinkovka itself from the east. It means that according to the personnel, the enemy approached the settlement as close as possible, then the APU worked on them, with the support of an armored vehicle. There were also reports that the fire damage was inflicted by tanks, but we will leave that for the moment. The main thing here is that the enemy is making these attempts to circumvent without actually leaving to take Avdeevka, to cling to its northern part. Some clarifications have been added. Somewhere it is a red zone, somewhere on the contrary it is a gray zone. Well, today it looks something like this. Here we can assume, based on vector A, that the enemy will try, well, most likely in my opinion, let's make a remark like this, to attack not only northwest but also, roughly speaking, west-northeast, that is, as much as possible. But in the near future, we will observe, most likely of a positional nature of the fighting, because the main emphasis now is placed. If we are talking about the Merchant Lyman sector of the front, on the Lyman direction, to which we are now moving, rather than Kapinskaya. Because Kapinskaya implies the involvement of larger forces than were concentrated in this direction. The enemy has drawn conclusions, so he puts the main efforts on the Lyman direction, specifically the attorney Yampolev, Katorskaya, to go out along the cascade of stakes along the river. And active hostilities continue. Fresh footage was published today, but we do not record any changes. The enemy pulled the tanks as close as possible to the forward positions. There were shots of tanks being shot down and destroyed by the Russian armed forces, but we do not record any changes. I repeat, we managed to repel these attacks. Nevertheless, they do not give up trying, and most likely, taking into account the transfer of more forces to the subtemporal, that is, to the Lyman direction of forces, they will try to develop greater success here, and use, I repeat, large forces. We are moving to the Bakhmut-Chassiar direction. So here, I will tell you a little more about the situation. According to Bogdanovka, do the attacks continue? Yes, they continue, but they have a positional character, including north of Bogdanovka. There are a number of attacks both in the western direction and in the southwestern directions, from the Russian troops. There are battles with varying success north of Bogdanovka along the forest strips. As you remember, the APU managed to throw back Russian troops before, knock out from a number of positions. Then the enemy regained a number of positions at the intersection. Well, actually, the main fighting continues at the intersection, if along the north of Bogdanovka. As for Bogdanovka itself, the situation, let's say, is positional and fighting, but the enemy is trying to further strengthen its grouping in Bogdanovka itself, and also attack with larger forces, because it assumes to take control of one of the forest belts that goes from Bogdanovka to the railway station Vyonovka. That is, conditionally align the front line, well, and continue further offensive actions, only again, as at Senkovka, it is assumed to have a wider coverage. Because, if we speak for the tactics that the Russian command is changing, just the same wide coverage. We used to say that in order to disperse our forces as much as possible, that is to conduct additional attacks in neighboring areas, to disperse forces and artillery strikes, including reconnaissance. Now we see that this is supplemented not only by the frequency of attacks in neighboring areas, but also by attacks with the widest possible coverage, that is, both to the north and in the Bogdanovka, and to the east of it. There are attacks in order to disperse our forces as much as possible. Therefore, the fighting continues in this sector of the front. We do not record any changes in Bogdanovka, but the railway station Vianovka is under clarification of this area, because various reports are received that there were attempts to align the front line along the railway and from south to north along the forest belt, but no new information was received subsequently, in addition, that there are active battles going on. As for Ivanovsky, it means that here, yes, the Russian troops do not abandon attempts to improve the tactical situation south of the Popovsky Forest, to cling to a number of landings and gain a foothold in them. Including attacks from Kromov, the Kromov district also continue, and the main goal, of course, is to connect their assault groups and make their way as far as possible to Ivanovo, from the position of the north. In general, the enemy is preparing to increase pressure on this sector of the front, and in the coming days, based on the information that is available today. At the same time, it means there are a number of messages, perhaps you have also read this, that the concentration. We have also said this, there is a concentration of some forces in the Russian Bakhmut, which naturally can be involved, but not only on Ivanovskaya, but they can also strike in the direction of the city of Yar, and this blow will just be more distracting. Well, of course he will disperse our forces, and then, as they say, they may find a gap in the defense, which is what they are counting on. Therefore, they are trying to align the front line to the east of Bogdanovka, along one of the forest belts, in order to then try to attack with a wider coverage, that is, Bogdanovka, along the railway, along one of the forest belts. Naturally, there will be attempts to advance across open fields, as it was before, but these small infantry groups will be there, on average 3 or 4 people, in order to disperse our forces as much as possible. Well, at this moment, a blow to Ivanovska. But again, these are the messages that come to us. To what extent all Russian troops will be able to implement this, of course, is a question, because drones play a very important role here in Pivi, especially in the factor when Russian troops are advancing, with the support of armored vehicles. That is, there is one moment when the personnel, armored vehicles, it will definitely be hit, destroyed. Well, that's why the enemy is trying to advance to Ivanovskoye in the first place, since there is the shortest possible shoulder of the open field, that is, where you can find a minimum of development, and so on and so on. Therefore, the main goal is to break through to Ivanovsky, and then, through the planting, if we say long-term, by the hour of Yar. For a long time for the direction, but I think I said more about it. According to Kleshivka, we do not record any changes in the positional nature of the fighting. At the same time, the eastern Kleshivka at the helmet is delivered. We have been talking about this for the last few days. The enemy is attacking, conducting assault operations. There was a repaint somewhere, that is, a gray zone was added instead of a red one. They did not gain a foothold west of the Alabaster Stake, but at the same time, there is pressure from the north along the railway to the south. We do not record any new changes, except that the enemy is pressing here in a southerly direction. It is possible to repel most of the attacks. The attack was carried out on one of the positions of the Apu fought back, the enemy retreated to their original positions. But this suggests that they will try to align the line as much as possible along the railway line in this sector of the front, that is, along the railway to the south, in order to then have a wider coverage, that is, here if we are talking with Bogdanovka. There is an analogy, when exactly small bridgeheads are created, from which Kleshivka is more likely to be attacked later, and the tactics of dispersing forces as much as possible are involved. But this is my opinion, my vision. Let's leave a remark, and of course the messages of a number of fighters with whom I communicate from the direction, that they say that there is just the same probability, because the enemy has numerical superiority, and naturally he will use it, well, most likely in this kind of tactics. Because it is manifested today. We are moving to the Avdeevka direction. We will start not with the map, but more with the news background, with the agenda that was, with the summaries. So, but about this briefly. From the Deputy Commander of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade. So in fact, very heavy battles, very heavy, the enemy has superiority. Accordingly, there is a message, that the fighting is even fiercer, than it was during the battles for Bakhmut, the battle for Bakhmut. We once talked about this with you, that Avdeevka is not Bakhmut. Here, well, this is not exactly the situation, it is much more complicated, because he approached Bakhmut. It was not possible to stop him on the flanks. Here just the same, the main emphasis was placed on the flag, the northern flank, but the southern one was already ready, and then, only the offensive on the city itself. Therefore, the situation is different, it is very, very complicated. Actually, the fighters report as it is. This is the first moment. The second point is that today the official message of the speaker of the Tauride Defense Forces was published, that there is a possibility that we may lose part of the position by moving to more advantageous positions. There is such a thing as maneuverable defense. You can Google this information in more detail. It implies, well, first of all, exhausting the enemy, that is, in this case, Russian troops. At the same time, yes, it is retreating. Troops are withdrawing from equipped positions to more favorable ones, because there can be significant losses on those equipped, and there is a very high probability of not holding them, even in a short time. And now, of course, we are moving to Avdeevka. What's what? Probably the map will already be very clear to you. Yes, because there are garden associations, and an opponent in the near future. We talk to you with an experienced water. There is already some activity. That is, in the near future, there is a possibility that they will attack in the northeast direction, in the direction of one of the forest belts, or let's conditionally, in the direction of the Brevno complex. That is, it will try to surround Avdeevka. That is, without Avdeevsky, as Sahim, and of course, if we speak for the retention of the filter station, it becomes meaningless. Because then the situation will be very, very difficult if you don't break through their defenses. Well, taking into account the fact that the enemy is advancing in January and February, and we cannot in fact say yes. Stop it here, and record daily, unfortunately, progress. Yes, so there is a possibility of losing a number of positions. But, I would say, this is a maneuverable defense, in the form in which it is. I think I commented on the situation from the news background, as much as possible, in an acceptable way. Now on the northern flank. This means that the area of a typical positional nature of the fighting continues, but I repeat, they are not as yesterday more distracting. There are attempts to attack Avdeevsky, like Sahim. Again they are positional and distracting, because the main blows are now still directed at the log complex. According to the situation, it is quite dynamic, as reported directly by the fighters from the field. It is given during the day, and somewhere to discard the enemy, and somewhere to go to him. That is, within the red and the outskirts of the gray. There are active hostilities going on within the gray and the outskirts of the red zone. The situation is quite dynamic, but actually, the fighters directly from the field, including the information provided, confirm that the enemy is attacking with very serious large forces. And plus Boris Rosen previously published a video of one of the fighters of the Wagner PMCs, who reported on the installation of the flag in Avdeevka. Therefore, the information, well, let's just say, should be perceived as it is. The enemy has transferred very combat-ready units this time. Secondly, the fact that there is a Wagner PMC's instructor there, it also has information. That is, during the battle for Bakhmut, they did not get very much experience, and naturally they are implementing it in Avdeevka itself. Therefore, this factor also cannot be written off in any case that experienced units, brigades were involved here. Not just numerical superiority, but the most experienced units from the Russian side. Secondly, the fact that there are very serious instructors on their part, who also have combat experience in Bakhmut itself. There is such a moment at the same time that we are now. But now the main fighting is the log complex, as well as attempts to break through as much as possible, which means that, in the direction of Provoxelny Lane, active fighting is approximately in this area. Along including Industrial Avenue, there were attempts to break through Timiryazov Street. Well, I repeat, the goal is to align the station lane. Conditionally align the front line along the bridge to another one going to Heroes Street, and added, as you noticed, some clarifications along the alley of the 50th anniversary of the X. Here too, the enemy is pressing with very serious forces. It is possible to contain it somewhere, but there are already added refinements. There is a little more red zone appeared here. Very, very heavy fighting. To the south, In the south now, probably, many people are interested, as I noticed from the information that is being served on the network. What is being discussed, the south is even interested in the field of the north, because there is a probability of encirclement of Zenith and Cheburashka fortified areas. Well, accordingly, very heavy fighting is going on in the area of the Vinogradniki 2 gardening partnership, as well as along several streets of Chistyakovo-Sabornaya. Well, I will also comment on the information with Lesno Lane, because they wrote to me in the messages to comment in more detail. It means that active hostilities are continuing south of the Chemist district of the 9th quarter. Here, naturally, all necessary measures are being taken by the AFU to prevent Russian troops from gaining a foothold along one of the to advance and gain a foothold along one of the forest belts, just the same leading from the positions of the northeast inexperienced, in the direction of the Garden Association to the intersection of the Highway T0605, and at the same time there are active hostilities along Sabornaya Street. Most likely, it is just the same to delay the Russian forces in order to prevent them from concentrating the main blow. They were asked to comment on the situation with Lesnaya Perulek Street, Lesnaya Lane, Lesnaya Street, so there were a number of reports that allegedly Russian troops managed to enter the street. Look, according to the drone footage that was published, this is shelling from the Russian side, artillery shelling of this area. But it is unknown whether the Russian troops went further, because a number of media resources did not quite correctly present the information initially, that it was allegedly the APU firing at the position of the Russian troops, so they noted the advance, but in fact it was the opposite. The situation is not known whether Russian troops took offensive actions after that. But in any case, there are no video confirmations of their presence yet. Frames from the Kio binding drones. A difficult situation, as you can see. I think they reported from the field, as much as possible, that there are plus officials about the fact that there is likely to be a maneuverable defense here. Moving on. On this in principle, now we will finish a couple of moments. I wanted to say one more thing about Avdeevka. So one of the fighters also reported from the direction that in the last hour, it's just the same from 12 to 1. Well, roughly speaking, there 5 minutes before the broadcast, he reported that there was a flight of 10 Kabov. That is so that you understand the number. If the previous days we said 40, 45, 50 Kabov. Avdeevka and the direction, yes during the day, now in an hour a little less than 5 minutes to 5, yes. In 55 minutes 10 Kabov arrival. This is a huge amount in fact. And the enemy increases the pressure with air bombs, strikes. There is such a thing. Therefore, you should also understand how difficult it is now for our soldiers in Avdeevka. We turn to the Kurakovsky direction. I wrote for him in my telegram, in the morning summary, which means that some changes have been added there. Yes, the footage was published again. The enemy made another attempt to advance along the eastern part of the settlement, north from Georgievsky Stavka, in the western direction. Well, it means that a fire defeat was inflicted, the enemy retreated, but retreated again not to their original positions. We are recording a partial advance, entrenched in several houses. Therefore, the situation for yesterday, the situation for today. On a section up to 200 meters wide, the advance was up to 100 meters. At the same time, one of the positions is marked where the enemy was present. As we can see, he does not abandon attempts to improve the tactical situation, both in the eastern part, and to break through the Garden Association, to the southeastern part, northeastern and southeastern to the south already, on the outskirts of the southwestern St. George's rate. At the same time, we have attacks in the direction of field reservoirs. That is, here we end up exactly where we started, that the enemy is one of the tactics to attack with the widest possible coverage. In order to disperse forces, that is, to use its numerical superiority, to disperse just the same forces of the armed forces of Ukraine. That is, first of all, Georgievka, what we said, then the Garden Association of the field reservoirs direction, the Victory direction, and another section southeast of Victory. There was an attack in the direction of one of the T-shaped crossroads of intersections from the enemy, that is, art preparation, then assault actions. The result remains on refinement. The gray area added today looks like this. In other words, the main attacks as we see, are either on the locality, or T-shaped intersections, or field reservoirs. In any case, The enemy here is trying just the same, with the widest possible coverage, that is, to bypass the victory as well. What we said, most likely they will try to go north, and it means there were attacks in this direction, they managed to repel. But as we can see, there is also an attempt to circumvent victory from the south, that is, the tactics of dispersal of forces. Active military operations continue in Novomykhailovka. The situation remains to be clarified, as there are intense hostilities in the settlement itself and to the south of it. The situation remains dynamic with varying success, so for now it is being clarified. Somewhere it is possible to push the enemy, somewhere he increases the pressure in the south, on the contrary, naturally transferring additional forces and striking blows in neighboring areas, which are just the same distracting. Therefore, we also have a rather difficult situation in the South Donetsk sector of the front. We do not record any changes in the Orekhovsky direction, in the Velikonovoselkovsky direction.